So we are talking today with Ain Grooms, who is in Education Policy and Leadership Studies at the College of Education. And Ain was at the Obermann Center, was that last summer?
Yeah,
Yeah, with an
great.
interdisciplinary research
Yes.
grant.
Yeah,
So yeah, aren't you glad it was last summer?
yeah.
Yeah.
Got to enjoy the house, so yes.
And then we are also joined today by Laura Gray, who is the Director of Diversity and Cultural Responsiveness at the Iowa City Community School District. And Laura and Ain know each other in part because they are both on the district's Equity Advisory Committee. So thank you both for being here today. Ain, I'm hoping that you can start by just giving us kind of a broad overview of some of your research. I know you've got a lot of things going on, but just to help us to know where some of your work is right now and what are some of your interests.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be a part of it. And thank you, Laura, for also being able to join. It's nice to see both of you, on Zoom. So my research really focuses on access to opportunity for kids of color. And so that means a broad range of things, right? So I focus a lot on leadership, like school leaders, school administrators, and also education policy. And that could be federal level policy, state level, local level. And so that covers a range of things. But right now I'm focusing on recruitment and retention of educators of color. And that's everything from paraeducators all the way up through superintendents. Because as schools are diversifying, the workforce is not keeping pace. And it's important for kids of color to see themselves reflected in teachers and leaders, but also for white children to see, people of color in positions of authority, right? So that's one main focus. Doing some work around absenteeism and students missing school and really digging into why and what's the community response to that, school response to that. How do we better support kids? Some other research is around, what else am I working on? Doing some work around like school choice a little bit, and some other things, but I think specifically, really my work just focuses on kids of color and making sure that we have better school systems. And again, thinking that school systems encompasses a lot of things: people, curriculum, pedagogy, leadership. What does that mean about discipline? What does it mean about, disproportionality in special education? Like all of these things, distilling that down to making sure that we're doing a better job of supporting kids of color in public schools.
So through that kind of wide array of work, but those various lenses on children of color in public schools and our communities, what's coming up for you in recent weeks around through the pandemic?
Right. So really, it just reaffirms that all of these problems that people are now seeing, like I think there's a lot of people who are shocked, like, I can't believe that this is happening. Whereas other people, myself included, are like, no, these have been problems for quite some time. And so I think really focusing on the disparities that exist, and not only in public schools, but sort of in society, right? The ways in which people in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color have been marginalized as far as, again, not only education, but housing, transportation, healthcare, environmental justice, employment, right? The list goes on. And yet we're seeing this sort of, it came into a perfect storm in schools when, students who rely on school lunches, you had to figure out how are we going to, support students in that way. Students who feel the safest that they feel in schools are not able to be in schools right now. And so really digging into how is this pandemic affecting what's going to happen in the long run? Because we're doing a lot of band-aids, like let's fix this immediate problem, but recognizing that in 6 months, in a year, we're still going to be feeling the effects of this. So how do we do better, right? Like that's the ultimate question for all my research. How do we do better? And if I had the answer, I'd be on a book tour somewhere. But you know, so anyway, so all of this to say, I think that this pandemic, unfortunately, is bringing, well, fortunately, I guess, and unfortunately, bringing new attention to problems that have existed for decades. And so now the question is, how do we respond?
Mm-hmm.
How do we do better? How do we respond? And how do we support financially and sort of socially support those communities and those people who are at risk the most, or at the most need?
So Laura, kind of zooming this into the local, if you could tell us first just more about your role in the district, and then what you've been seeing since basically spring break.
So I'm the Director of Diversity and Cultural Responsiveness, and basically I work in the Equity Department with restorative justice, restorative practices and circles, and also cultural proficiency, implicit bias. I work with multicultural gender fair and LGBTQ initiatives, and also I work through the TLC grant with the cultural proficiency team. And so what I do is a lot of training for principals and teachers and around those things. And also sometimes we go in and help out, mediate, or do restorative circles to repair harm amongst staff members or parents and students, or students and students. So that's basically the work I do, is in a more of a coaching training role at the district office. Since spring break, we've shifted. So we do a lot of meetings via Zoom in regards to, how we're going to function, what needs to be done, so on and so forth. But also different administrators have taken on food distribution duties. So me in particular, I work with Sharita Martin in my department, and we go and distribute food, and it looks different for different people. So some administrators just show up to a site during a certain time frame, but because her and I work a particular route, we park our cars behind Wes, jump in a van, fill it up with coolers, and then drive to to Cold Thatcher or Regency. And we do an hour at each, or about 50 minutes at each of them.
I'm sorry, just for people who aren't familiar with those places, tell us more about where it is that you're going.
So Cold Thatcher and Regency are trailer park communities on the east side. Like, would that be considered the east side? Maybe it's more the west side. Not really sure, but they're up by the county grounds, the fairgrounds.
Okay.
Up there by old the highway.
Yeah.
So they're in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And it's cool because we get to see our kiddos. Those are students who belong to either Hills or Northwest Junior High, or they belong to West High. And so as a former principal of Northwest Junior High, I see some of my former kiddos. And so it's good to see them and have conversations with them. The students and families are super grateful to receive food. And I know that we, as a district, we are feeding, you don't even have to be from ICCSD. You just have to be 1 to 18 and you can get the meals. But, in having conversations with them about, well, what are you doing while you're off? I'm finding that many of our kids haven't been doing the academic portions that are offered. And, as a district, we've tried to make provision to curtail any, reason why a person wouldn't be able to. So students are able to sign up for internet access that we've been providing, and also laptops. So any student in our district could ask for a laptop, ask for internet access. As long as they don't already have internet access, they've been provided internet access. So even with that, at the elementary level specifically, I know that some students just have not chimed in, have not taken advantage of it. At the high school level, where school is mandatory, they're still missing some kiddos who just have not logged in, chimed in. So that's kind of concerning there.
So one thing we are talking about in kind of our pre-conversation with this is what some of these issues look like when you're in a virtual world. So like Ain, you referred to doing work on absenteeism. What does absenteeism look like virtually? Like how, and so I'm curious to that for you, Ain, and then I'm curious to you, Laura, as to like how educators are trying to keep track of these kids.
So I think, the main thing that we recognize right now is, since spring break, I think nationally, is that we're all just trying to keep it together, right? Like there's no playbook for when a pandemic hits, turn to page 5, right? And follow these instructions.
Oh, you didn't get that? I've got that.
So maybe it was got lost in the mail, or it was too big of a file for my email, right? If only. But no, and so I think, right, like as we have tried to figure out as best we can, like how to proceed for this 6 weeks through, or 8 weeks through the end of the school year, we recognize that some of the problems, pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, are still sort of manifesting, right? So when we think about absenteeism, and there are students who are not attending school, is it a policy question? Is it the fact that school is optional, right? Or is it a, individual question where, even if computers are provided and Wi-Fi is provided, but there might be some obstacles around scheduling in the home that preclude a student from getting online for school, right? Or maybe a child is working. And the flip side is, if there is a high school student that's not online because they need to work to contribute, that also means that there's a high school student that technically is an essential worker that is working in a job that is putting their health at risk every single day, right? Or their parents are working jobs that are putting their health at risk every single day. So what are those long-term ramifications from that? So, in thinking about absenteeism, how do we have to sort of frame what that means in a virtual space, and also I think some of the concerns with how we think about education can come from a sort of a negative disciplinary stance. Well, like, why isn't that kid in school? We need to figure it out. It's the parents' fault. They don't want their kid to be in school, as opposed to recognizing, like, oh, maybe there are some obstacles that we can help students overcome. And I think we need to have that same perspective in a virtual space. Like, what are the things that might be preventing kids from attending school? Because no matter what they say, most kids want to be in school because that's where their social network is. Like, you can not like math class or history class, but chances are all of your friends are at school, or most of them. So that's where you want to be. So there's got to be some other reason. And like, what can we do to sort of tease out those reasons and try to address them individually, instead of having this negative, authoritarian, like, how dare that kid not come to school? They just don't care. And that's also amplified if it's a kid of color, or, a student from a low income background, or a student with disabilities, which is a whole other discussion around disparities in an online world. Like, how are we educating students that, need special education services, right? So anyway, all of this to say, like, how do we reframe the issue from less of a negative, placing the blame on students, and recognizing, like, we're in a life-altering situation right here. And so let's come from a positive space of how do we engage with families and communities better in order to make sure that we can support our kids and getting them, into school online or in person, if it was still brick and mortar schools, right? If we were still
Right.
able to go to school in person, the same questions and solutions still apply.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I just wanted to note was I have multiple friends who are teachers, and I mean and I'd love to hear more of this from you, Laura, but have been just so trying to find all of their students and be in contact with them. But one person who teaches up in Cedar Rapids and teaches an AP class, and one of his students told him that she's working at a bread factory right now, and they were giving her a 1 hour break to take her AP test in the like community room or something like that.
Wow.
So yeah, it was just an interesting example of some of
Mhm.
what you're saying. So Laura, how has our local district been trying to be there for kids and know what's going on with them?
So I think we've tried to do multiple things, but the first thing was to make sure kids were fed, because that was probably the biggest concern. And the community is super duper triggered by this thought that we're not feeding, especially our most needy kiddos. So the food distribution was the first go-to. And then they started to figure out academically what needed to be done. Our district chose, like the DE gave various options just up until the end of the school year, which was to either be voluntary, mandatory, a combination, right? Or to do nothing and you have to make it up or something. And so we chose to do a combination where elementary is optional. However, there's a schedule for all the teachers to go on and put in a certain amount of time with their kiddos on certain days so that they're before their classes weekly. And especially understanding that a lot of our teachers are parents
Mm-hmm.
of various age kids, right? So
Mhm.
like trying to maneuver that piece. But then at the high school level, it's mandatory. And so, students had the option of withdrawing if they felt like they couldn't, pass a course or, doing the assignments. And then again, I believe that different subject areas took a day for students to chime in and do that work. So then we had the combination there. Uh, they provided the Wi-Fi, provided laptops for families that were in need, although all of our secondary already were one-to-one. And then at the elementary level, they had math workbook distribution so that, maybe the online component for some, maybe the workbook is a better option. So they distributed that. The expectation was that students jump on different software so that we can still monitor progress monitor, and keep a grasp on that, and so that's been another thing there. I know that in our return to learn plan, we are promising that we'll meet the needs of our students with special needs, our ELL population, and try to be as equitable as possible. And the DE was clear that they would audit various districts who are clicking yes, we plan to do that. So there's a team forming now that is trying to put those things in place. But some of the conversations we've been having around it is in, making education be what it needed to be all along in regards to possibly moving towards standards-based assessments and assignments, and not thinking about time so much, like, or the behavioral side of education where, you have to put this amount of time in, or, if you do these things, then you can pass.
Can
But
you, for people who are unfamiliar with standards-based education and forms of assessment, can you, because I think people's brains automatically go to standardized testing, and I don't think that's what it is. So
no, so like every grade level, there's these standards, core standards that is, in other words, is saying, in order for you to meet the requirements of learning at this level, they're saying students should be able to do these things, right? And so you're really assessing students based on what they can do, how much they know, are they able to master a skill? Um, and there's a system to that where that there is testing involved, there's formative assessments involved in trying to assess whether or not, and formative assessments isn't just bubbles all the time. Sometimes that could be a verbal assessment, but or project-based assessment, but whatever the formative assessment is that's getting, trying to measure what the student knows, they have multiple opportunities to meet that, right? And so you're not grading them on the behavior. You're not grading them on how many times. You're not grading them on whether or not they followed instructions or their effort even, which is very, very much a shift in education, right? But you're grading them on what they know. So a student might master something in a week.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're able, then the expectation that they're able to move on. So then that's a thought that's out there. Shifting the way in which we grade in regards to like zeros, just making sure that social emotional learning is embedded in the curriculum so that we're meeting the needs, of all of our students first, like that core need, the heart and soul piece, and getting to that. So those are things that we all desire to happen, and, potentially, are thinking that this is the best time to embed some of those things. So those have been the conversations that we've been having. And, we have different teams reaching out to school districts that have done it successfully. Like I know we had a team that talked to Justin Blights from Cedar Rapids, who's the assistant principal over there. And he's been the only one thus far I know that's been able to do a school-wide restorative justice. And a part of that component is there's a mandatory SEL component embedded in their day. And so, we've been looking at that as a model for our junior highs and trying to figure out what to do at the elementary and the secondary level with SEL, with an SEL curriculum. So that is a shift, and that's something that we know needs to happen. And I know that the district is devoted to making education what it needs to be for all. I definitely think, though, that one of the pieces that needs to be done, and we've talked about this, is getting a voice from the diversity, like hearing what it would take for them to show up, what it would take, for like what's happening, because we really don't know, like those people who have been absent, who've been missing, we're guessing, are they working? Are they, what I'm saying? Like if we could really hear from those stakeholders to find out what is it, what are we missing, so that we can keep that in mind when planning for next year.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to just insert. Luckily, you guys have an amateur educational transformation fan in your midst. So SEL is social emotional learning. So just it's lots of acronyms. So Ain, what conversations are happening in the College of Ed about how to best support what's going to be happening down on the ground at the K12 level, maybe actual conversations and the conversations you're hoping might happen as well?
So I probably shouldn't admit this, but I think what happens in a lot of colleges of ed is we don't talk across departments as much as we should, which I think is also reflective of just sort of institutions in society. They don't connect in the ways that they should. And so it would be great to have more conversations with faculty across all departments, right? In teaching and learning, what are they doing around like teacher preparation programs? In some of our counseling programs, what are they doing around training school counselors to work in a new sort of school setting? And I'm in educational leadership. And so I was actually thinking about what am I going to be teaching content-wise next semester? In one of my classes, I was thinking about having like a spin on sort of leadership in times of crisis, and sort of thinking about like the pandemic, but thinking back to like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey, like earthquakes in Puerto Rico, right? So things have happened that have shifted schools and school systems. So how do we learn from that and say, hey, this thing worked, what could shift for future, right? And not saying like a pandemic is the same as an earthquake, but
Yeah,
thinking about like shifting the entire landscape of what we thought we knew.
mm-hmm.
And I think school is one of the things that has just looked the same, whether right or wrong, for like decades, right? Like my parents, you know, our parents, I'm sure, went to schools. It was like a bell. They go to the next class, a bell, right? And so that's one side of it. I think the hard part is that there's just such a lack of information. It's one thing if we could say, this is what schools are going to look like in the fall. So let's start now planning for that. But because it changes daily, minute to minute, information isn't as readily accessible. And so it's hard to, so we can have these conversations that are broadly speaking, like what could we do? What might schools look like? But we still don't know. We don't even know what it means for us, right? For the university or for Iowa City, is in terms of planning for fall and how to, because having broad conversations can only get you so far. There needs to be like, this is the real world. And I think sometimes academics forget that like the things that we talk about, like that's great that I can sit around and write a grant or write an article about something, but there are like, school is real life. Like things are happening today, tomorrow, this week, last week in schools. And that disconnect between research and practice, I think this is a great opportunity to sort of bridge that gap and say, what do you need? How can we help? Instead of like, this is what we know, schools need to be this way. So I'd like to see more conversations, not only about teaching in a virtual landscape, but how do we, again, like I was saying before, how do we do better? How do we better support kids that have variety of needs, right? Whether that's thinking about like, as schools become more diverse, what does that mean about the curriculum? Because just because we're online doesn't mean that you should not be having diverse authors in your English classes, right? Like it doesn't mean that we have now erased all of the work we were doing before. And it's like, well, we have to teach online. Yes. And you can be, right, you can still do culturally relevant pedagogy. You're just doing it online. And I don't mean just as if it's easy, because I will not be that person teaching K12. But some of the things around the conversations around shifting education can still happen in a virtual landscape. And I think we're in this space of either or, like either we're teaching online or in person. But yes, and what does that mean about what you're teaching and how you're teaching? And how do we, engage with teachers who are doing a great job? I don't want it to sound like I think teachers are horrible. They're amazing, underappreciated in a variety of ways. But at the same time, how do we then take all of this new knowledge about teaching and teaching better, teaching our students better, and transfer that into a virtual landscape? So I feel like I sort of talked all the way around it, but again, it's hard to have conversations when we don't have definitive information to plan for. Everything is so up in the air. Everything's like, well, maybe it's this or that.
Though I love that question of what do you need and how do we help you? And, how do we get our colleges of education and our, teacher educator preparedness and what's happening in schools aligned? It seems so important, and perhaps this is an opportunity for that.
Yeah, I hope so. Laura, we got to do something.
Yeah. Any other closing thoughts? Because otherwise I think we're coming up on our time. Anything either of you wants to share before we leave?
Well, I just want, whoever has the idea of how to motivate our community, our educators, to not feel like this is um, so far out of our locus of control, especially with things being unknown, you know, with there being already a sense of weariness to a certain extent when it comes to closing the opportunity gap. Like, I mean, if you are just like a motivator, cheerleader, like whatever those people know that you can give us, you know what I'm saying? We need to light a fire. We need to light a fire that will extend past the pandemic and get our educators understanding that they are the change. And whatever comes, like we'll just have to be resilient, put our heads together and figure it out.
Thank you. That's a great ending and a great call for hopefully somebody out there listening, or multiple people. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.